Once upon a briny time, in the marshy heart of medieval England, there lived an eel. Not just any eel. This was an eel that paid your rent, defined your identity, and maybe, just maybe, held the secrets of the cosmos. Today, we're slipping into the muddy, magical world of a creature so legendary it confounded kings, confused scientists, and made accountants cry. Welcome to the historical saga you never knew you needed, told one slippery wiggle at a time. This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, joined by my wonderful co-host, Dr. Lynn Robbins.
Hey everyone, I am really excited about our topic and our guest today. We have Dr. John Wyatt Greenlee, and he is a medievalist and a cartographic historian who is engaged in outreach and public engagements to make the history of eels more widely known, or as we like to call him, the Surprised Eel Historian. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I never heard myself say, I am so excited to talk about eels today, but I absolutely am.
You know, I get that a lot, really. Nobody ever thinks it's a bit like the Spanish Inquisition. Like, nobody expects to be interested in eels until they are.
It's like that show, Everything is Cake, or whatever. Is it
Oh
cake?
my God. Is
They're
it
like
an eel
everything
or
can
is it
cover history
cake?
book.
Is that a
It's
cake or an
eels?
eel? It's like, no, it's an eel. It's always eels. It's always
What was
eels.
the-
It just
what was the
it
cause
just
for
turns
this
out to be
war?
always eels.
It's eels. Before we get into the eel stuff, I want to just curious about another part of your intro there.
Yeah,
Cartographic historian.
sure.
What
Yeah.
exactly does that mean? Because my initial, I know what cartographers are, but mostly because of, I think it's like level 3 or 4 of the original Halo, which is called the Silent Cartographer.
Mhm.
It's probably the first exposure that I had to that word.
Yeah. Right. So a cartographer is somebody who makes maps, right?
Mhm.
Which actually is what I do. We can talk about that at another point, but like that's for work. I draw maps for a living. But when I started my back in grad school, I was initially interested in maps and cartographic history. So like that's thinking about the way that people sort of understand the space around them and the world around them, and then draw it, right? And so like make a visual representation of the world. And we tend to think about maps as being we're used to maps all the time, right? There's maps on our phone, there's maps on subway walls, there's maps everywhere. And we're used to just thinking about them as being sort of an honest representation of truth. But maps are like any other text. They're constructed. They are, when you put together a map, you have to decide what goes on the map and what doesn't. So there's always sort of questions of authorship and intent with a map. And so I was really interested in the way that people have mapped the world and what that says, what a map of the world from a specific time says about how the people who made the map were thinking about the world, were thinking about themselves, were thinking about other people. So maps are a really interesting way to get into sort of historical mindsets. If you look at the ways that people draw the world and think about the world, you can get a better understanding for how they see the world.
Yeah, they can convey a lot of information. I think we've talked about this on the show before, and I'm not 100% sure it counts as a map, but on my father's office, when I was growing up, he had Napoleon's March into Russia, that thing where it starts like really with a really
Oh,
thick band and then
yeah.
gets really thin, and then you see the
Yeah,
retreat
that's a really
or whatever.
fascinating.
Yeah.
That's a really fascinating. It is a map, right? It's a map that looks at both sort of space and time, and also sort of the size of the armies, right? So it's trying to
Yeah.
do. It does like three different things all at once, very concisely. It's a really interesting document.
Yeah, if you we'll put a link to it in the description below. But if you haven't checked it out,
Yeah.
it's a really cool map to look at to see how maps can convey all sorts of things.
Hmm.
So, obvious question here: how did these maps lead you to eels?
I don't maps lead everybody to eels. That's been my experience. Right. No. So yeah. So uh, I had a completely separate career. I was coached college volleyball for about 10 years, and I went back to school. And initially, I said I was really interested in maps, and I wanted to uh, work on my doctoral dissertation. I wanted to write my dissertation on spatial history, on cartographic and spatial history, and thinking about the ways that sort of people in pre-modern England thought about and represented space. And for a very un-eel related reason, I was looking at maps of London from the 17th mid 17th century for a seminar paper for a class on spatial history in grad school. And I needed a topic, so I was looking at maps just to try to find something. And I was interested in initially thinking about, so there's a Great Fire of London in 1666 burns the entire middle part of the city down, and the Parliament asks for commissions, a bunch of different new plans for the city that follow the straight lines and angles and very modern looking, right? Kind of the way that Hauptmann redoes Paris later on. And so they commission a bunch of things. They get a bunch of of submissions here, and then they decide just to screw it. We're just going to go back to the same street plan we had before, and basically we'll say the buildings have to be made out of brick rather than stone, and everybody has to set their buildings back 2 more feet from the street to help with fire codes. But they asked for a bunch of different sort of ways of thinking about what the city could be, and then just ignore it. And I was curious as to why that was, and I was curious about that moment where there's competing ideas about what London space might look like. And it turns out the reason that they scrapped all that was because they had half the population of London sitting out in tents in the middle of the field, and winter was coming, and they're like, oh hell, we need to get people back in houses. So that was actually not that interesting a question. But in the process, I noticed that a bunch of maps of London, these sort of city view maps from the early to mid 17th century, so 1600 to the last one's in 1666 actually, have these 2 ships on the Thames sort of sitting by themselves, labeled eel ships. And that stood out to me for a couple of reasons. One is I didn't know anything at all about eels, and I was like, well, that's weird. And if it said herring ships, and I'm like, okay, sure, whatever. But eels, and so we don't eat eels a whole lot in the U.S. or in sort of Western culture too much at this point. I didn't have any exposure to them at all, really. I was like, why eels? That doesn't make sense. But the other thing that didn't make sense about it was that there were other ships on these maps. Thames is a pretty crowded river, right? But these were the only ones with a label. And that mattered because the only other things on the map that had labels were neighborhoods, big civic monuments like the Tower of London or the Globe Theatre, places like that, places that couldn't sail away. And then you have these ships. So they have a label. So clearly they're enough of a civic landmark to matter, but they're also they're not permanent. They can leave. And it turns out that they're not even English. They're Dutch. They're Dutch eel ships, which made me really curious. And so this seemed like a pretty good topic for seminar papers. I want to get to the bottom of this, see what's going on with these guys. And there was initially what seemed like a really funny anecdote that okay, so they were Dutch ships and they had this weird charter from some point in the distant past that they could park on the Thames and sell their eels, but they couldn't leave the space vacant for more than 2 minutes, or it would or they'd have to start paying taxes on it and they'd lose the space. And so this crazy funny story that shows up in a bunch of little places is kind of an anecdote. But the more that I sort of pulled that apart, the less sense it made, because the different versions of the story told me that oh, well, this was a charter they got from Queen Elizabeth. No, this is a charter they got from King Charles. No, actually, this is a charter they got from King George. And the ruler changes, the circumstances change. The only thing that doesn't, and the sometimes it's 2 minutes, sometimes it's 5 minutes. It just so it seemed, I got curious about what was going on here, why these ships, what's going on with the story. Can I get to the bottom of what the charter actually says? And it turns out there's not actually a charter; it's a complete urban legend. And why, this was the really important question to me, why did these ships warrant being a landmark when they're not even English and they can leave? And it seemed like a pretty easy question to answer. I actually went and talked to the professor of the class who was on my dissertation committee about this before I started the paper. It's I don't know if I've got this is supposed to be a 30-page paper. I don't know that I've got 30 pages here. I have no idea what I'm going to find. And he said, that's fine. You pull on a string and you see what happens. And that's how historical research goes. And if it's 15 to 20 pages, it's 15 to 20 pages, and then we'll figure out what to do. But I got to the end of 30 pages and I had way more questions than I had answers, because it was okay, well, they're important. So why are they important? And then you start pulling on the thread and it just kept coming and coming and coming. And so I walked away from that paper. I wrote a paper. It's a pretty good paper. Felt good about it. But like, man, I had way more questions than answers at the end of it. And it was a really interesting topic. And I thought, well, I wonder if I can work this into the dissertation. And that's what I initially planned to do. I still wasn't planning on just writing about eels at that point. I was still planning on writing about maps and spatial history and the way that people understood space. And I was planning on getting into that topic with a chapter that talked about these eel ships and the fact that like they're a Dutch, like weird semi-sovereign space in the middle of London. That there's some issues about eels and English identity that make this a really sort of conflicted and fraught thing as you get into the middle of the 17th century with the Anglo-Dutch Wars. I should be able to wrap this up in 40 pages, like long chapter, but like doable. And like 120 pages in, and I'm still writing about the eels, and I haven't gotten up to the ships yet. And like, I looked around, like, no. I went and I talked to my dissertation committee. I'm like, guys, it's just all eels now. And to their credit, they rolled with that. And I was glad that they did. They tended to give me a lot of leeway. And which was good. It's kind of what I needed. And it wound up being a really fascinating topic. I know a lot of people get done with their dissertation and they're really like, man, I never want to think about this thing again. But I loved my topic. I really enjoyed working on it. And like, I'm still writing about eels. One of the reason that you all know me is through social media, initially Twitter and now Blue Sky, because over the course of writing my dissertation, I started sort of live tweeting bits of it. Like it's a really fun history, sort of unpacking what's going on with eels in English history, and they're kind of ridiculous sometimes. And so like I started tweeting the more ridiculous bits, and then added memes and things, and and wound up with a sort of a social media footprint that's decent size for actually pretty good size for a super niche medieval history topic. But yeah, and I'm still doing that. I do one eel history post every weekday.
Nice.
And I've been doing that for like 6 years at this point.
So to go back to,
sorry, that was a very long, rambling kind of answer. But
this is a total aside. But before you ask your question, Lynn, everything is eels now, or like it's all eels now. It sounds like a Rick and Morty episode, to be honest.
It's eels all the ways down.
It is eels all the way. And the thing was like this is like the part of what kind of did it for me was like once you start looking for eels in English history, they're everywhere. Like up through the mid 17th century, they're really everywhere. They're in the art, they're in the literature, they're in language, they're in like toponyms. It's just nuts. And it's one of those things that like nobody's ever pulled all the things together and looked at them all together at once. But when you do, you're like, oh, well, there's actually a lot here, and like this is a people with a really substantial like eel culture. It's a really important part of their culture. It's a part of their identity. But it's sort of voce. So it's sort of like it's easy to overlook, especially now in the modern era where we don't have a lot to do with eels. We tend to think about eels in kind of negative terms, and historians often will project that backwards. So sometimes they'll see eel metaphors or sort of eels, and they will use a sort of modern lens to think about negative, like, oh, they like this must be bad. We have to think about this as bad, but like you actually have to. It's a culture with the actual appreciation of eels, and that makes a difference in how we think about it.
Well, and that's why I was hoping to go back all the way to the foundation for those of us who have not had anything to do with eels. Can you just define what an eel is? Because I had to look up. My first thought was, oh, electric eels. And I looked that up, and they're not even eels. And then are they fish? They're kind of like snakes, but they're not. So can you just explain to those of us who have just seen it on a menu, maybe once or twice in our lives, what exactly is an eel?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I get that question a lot, right? Like, oh, like electric eels. It's like, no, actually electric eels are, as you said, electric eels are a completely separate fish. They're not actually an eel. And they don't live in Europe at all. They live just in South America. So they're fascinating fish in their own right. They're called a knife fish, but they're not an eel. Right. So the kind of eels that I study are what are sometimes called freshwater eels. The ones in Europe are called European eels. There's very similar ones in America called American eels. It's also Japanese eels and New Zealand longfin eels, and they're sort of all over the world, different eels, and they're all slightly different, and they all have slightly different sort of life cycles. But the ones that I study, the European eels, so they are a fish. They have this really fascinating life cycle where they are born in all the eels in Europe and all the eels in North America, for that matter, are born in the Sargasso Sea, sort of in the middle of the Atlantic, at a space that's where the waters are very calm, sort of in between a bunch of currents. So they're pretty much all born there, and they go through a really interesting migratory history and life cycle. Like body morphology changes. So they start out as these little teeny tiny things that are about the size of a grain of rice, called leptocephali, and they can't really even swim. And they're see-through. They don't have digestive systems. They absorb all their nutrients through the sea, and they just kind of float around the Sargasso. And eventually, they float enough they can wiggle a little bit. They float to the edge and they get picked up by a current, and the current, the Gulf Stream, will take them where they need to go. It's a bit like public transportation. So the American eels all get off the Gulf Stream in the Americas, and the European eels hang on and ride it basically all the way to Europe. They're different. They're technically different species. They have American eels are a little bit bigger. They have like I think 7 more vertebrae or something like that.
Oh,
So it's a fascinating question about like how they know where to go, but they
right.
do. Um, and but the European ones, they ride on the Gulf Stream all the way around. By the time they get to England, England's sort of the locus of my study. They don't look like little leaves or little grains of rice anymore. They look like what they call glass eels. So they look like eels, except they're teeny tiny, and they are still see-through. And they still don't have a digestive system. They're still absorbing nutrients through the skin. They um, they get to, and this can take up to 3 years. This like going from the Sargasso to England, so it takes a long time. Then they kind of hang out in the estuaries until they usually show up in the spring. They hang out in the estuaries until the water warms up sufficiently for them to be happy about it, and then they start heading upstream. And at this point, they change again. They have another body morphology change. They get darker, so they pick up color to help them hide in the mud. So they get sort of at this point they're what are called elvers, but they start getting kind of dark on top and light on the bottom, so that like they're hard to see from the top when you're looking down at the mud, and if you're a
Hmm.
fish looking up at the light, they're a little hard to see that way. They develop a digestive system. They still don't have reproductive organs. That doesn't happen until much later in life. And then they swim upstream and they find a place to live, and they'll stay there for in the wild. They'll stay there for 10 to 20 years. They can live much longer than that. Eels in captivity have lived into like the 70s and 80s. But
Oh,
generally in the
wow.
wild, they're like, I don't know, 12, 15 years. Um, and so they'll find a place to live and they'll hang out there, usually in like a single small area, a pond or a bit of creek. And we know this because scientists will repeatedly catch the same eel in the same stretch of river, year after year after year after year. And then at some point, they'll sort of something in their biological clock will tick over and they'll decide, oh, okay, it's time to head back out to sea to mate and die. And so they go through another change where they spend most of their lives as essentially juveniles. They're called yellow eels, but then they start developing kind of a darker, more silvery color to help them blend in with the ocean rather than the mud in the creeks and streams. And they head back downstream to the estuaries to head back out to sea. At this point, they stop eating. Their digestive system basically dissolves. They reabsorb it, and then they use that energy to build their reproductive system. So to that point, they don't have testes or ovaries. They develop them at that point, but they stop eating. And so they have this long swim all the way back to the Sargasso where they're not going to eat at all. So they pack on a lot of sort of fat before this, and then they basically self-cannibalize as they go. So they get back to the estuary, and then they head back out to sea to probably the Sargasso. That's the closest we've come to finding out where nobody has actually ever seen eels mating in real life, but seems to be where they go. So then they mate and die, and then the whole thing repeats itself. And they do this in super large numbers. To give you a sense of scale, eels are currently critically endangered. They've suffered about a 90% population crash in the last 40 years. There are a billion eels, roughly, that come ashore in Europe every year.
And that's after the 40% reduction.
Yes, after the 90%.
Oh, 90%
population
reduction.
crash.
Sorry, in the last
Yeah,
40 years.
in
Yeah.
40 years. Yeah.
Sorry.
So like historically, eels have made up as much as 50% of the fish biomass in like the downstream sections of rivers in Europe and America.
Wow.
So that means like if you took all the fish out of the water and weighed them all, like up to half that would be eels. So like
Wow.
they've been a huge part of stream ecologies and things like that, but also a huge part of sort of human food chains.
Mhm.
And
Um,
and particularly in Europe, and I'm sorry, particularly in England. There are other places in Europe where they eat eels. They eat eels in lots of places in the world. England has a very particular and intense eel history that is unique in Europe, pretty
yeah,
much.
there's a YouTube video of one of the older eel shops in London somewhere. And but how they serve it is a soupy mess of gravy, and it's just
Mhm.
preposterous that this is a dish that people will eat willingly. But yeah, it's very specific. It's definitely very particular. From
Well,
what I've
and
seen.
at this point, like if you go to London, you go to an eel shop, you'll probably get jellied eels or something like that. And frankly,
Yeah.
those look really unappealing to me. That's a fairly recent phenomenon in
Okay.
eel cuisine. That's like from the 19th century onward, they started doing jellied eels in the East End of London. And at this point, it's more a tourist thing than anything
Makes
else.
sense.
But medieval people ate eels in all kinds of ways. They could have eaten jellied eels. They knew how to jelly things, but we don't have any like evidence of it. But they ate them fried. They ate them sort of what we might think of as barbecued. They ate them all kinds of different ways. So, and everybody ate them, like kings, bishops, archbishops, peasants, merchants. Everybody ate eels, and by and large, everybody seemed to really enjoy them.
Before we step away for too far away from this, and it will transition
Mhm.
into the history, but what you described as their life cycle, from what
Yeah.
I understand, was really, really difficult to figure out, and is relatively
Yes.
new
Yeah.
biology as far as the
Yes.
understanding of the, like, obviously we haven't even closed the whole loop where we actually have seen how the
Mhm.
mating process takes place, but like putting that chain together was not an easy task.
No.
No, and people have been trying to do it for a really long time. So like Aristotle.
Yeah, right. He thought they just come out of the mud, right? He's like, they
Yes.
just spring
Yeah.
forth from the earth.
Yeah. So he dissected eels, looking for among other things, looking for the reproductive organs, and couldn't find them because, like I said, they don't develop until basically right before they head out to sea to mate and die. They spend almost their entire lives as juveniles. Um, so. So this led him to the conclusion that they are asexual, and this was a conclusion that held, right? And if they're asexual, then you have to figure out like how they in fact spring to life. So he thought that they came up out of the earth. He seemed to have missed the connection between the elvers coming upstream, growing into eels that then swam downstream, because there's a place in some of his writings where he talks about the way that like eels swim downstream, unlike these other fish that swim upstream. So like he knew that they left, but he didn't seem to have have clocked that they came.
That those were the same fish. That was
Yeah,
it.
and
The same,
so
Right.
so one of the things he's like, well, okay, so if you take a pond and then you drain it and then there's no eels, and you come back and you look the next day and there's eels, which actually does happen sometimes because they will bury themselves in the mud, especially in the winter. They hibernate in the mud, and then so like the water goes away and they're like, oh man, we got to go. And eels can travel they can live out of water for a little while, and they can travel over land if they need to. So like he drains the water of the pond, the eels are like, gotta go. So they appear and they head off. So he's like, well, there you go. They come out of the guts of the earth, I think is the term that he says. So Aristotle thinks they spring out of the mud. Pliny the Elder believed that they rubbed themselves against rocks and like rubbed off little flecks of skin, and that flecks of skin turned into other eels. Generally, most classical and medieval thinkers believed that eels were asexual, that somehow, and the method changed, but somehow they just they had this spontaneous generation. Hildegard of Bingen was one of the few medieval thinkers who thought that maybe actually they just like go out to sea and get busy where we can't see them. Which is exactly what happens. She was, as with many things, Hildegard was right, but nobody listened to her because you know how women, right? You just can't listen to women. Um,
Yeah.
so
We all know what happens when you do that.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
correct about things.
Yeah, that's the problem. No, nobody wants that, man. Nobody wants to be right.
Right.
It's much better to be interesting than wrong. Um, yeah, but that persists, right? So Sigmund Freud is doing the same thing that Aristotle was doing. Sigmund Freud took a summer in grad school basically to like go to Italy and dissect eels looking for testes. And he didn't find any because all of the eels he was looking at were juveniles. He found where he thought they probably would be, and he was right. But like he left his summer very frustrated frustrated about testes, as only Sigmund Freud could be. And yeah, and it. Let's see if I remember my dates here. So it wasn't until sometime after Freud that somebody actually found an eel with testes, and then sometime after that, say it's after Freud's youth that people discover like eels' sexual organs. I think testes after Freud, and somebody found eels with ovaries like maybe 20 years before Freud. So like there's newspaper articles like we've proved or sort of discovered the eel sexuality. And it's like, well, it was there all along. You just missed it. But yeah, it's a big thing. And then there's the question of like, okay, well, so this is what they do. Where do they go? And that was a really interesting question because, and was a bit of a sort of a scientific race in the early 20th century to like track down where the eels go to mate. And it sort of basically entailed like sort of looking all over the place for like the smallest eels you can find and sort of narrowing the search pattern down and eventually sort of settled on the Sargasso Sea as the most likely area. And at this point, like in the last 10 years, we've tracked eels using tracking devices to something close to the Sargasso Sea or like right to the edge of it. But it's hard, like even small tracking devices way down a fish, right? Like the size of an eel, because eels aren't that big. So even a small tracking device is a substantial burden on an eel.
When you're self-cannibalizing, I'm sure.
And that's the thing, right? Like, yeah, like they're to a fish that is like on the bare edge, like being able to make it back.
It can't compensate at all. It's like I got everything that I'm going to have.
No, yeah.
And so weight to me.
And so like we've been trying to like radio track eels for a really long time and succeeded of getting to the edge of the Sargasso Sea with a handful of them. So it seems likely that's where they go. Other eels in other parts of the world go to different similar spaces. So like the New Zealand longfin eels or the Japanese eels go to places in the Pacific, but similar spaces where like you have like pockets of very calm water that are surrounded by currents. There are no eels on the west coast of the United States because the currents don't take them that far. So all the eels on the U.S. historically have been on any basically any rivers that feed into the Atlantic or the Gulf of Mexico. So there have been eels like up in Texas, up in the Rio Grande, but there aren't anymore. They're extinct at this point.
What is it, just before we get to the history, I'm just interested now why so many have gone extinct. I mean, I can imagine because we've had a lot of animals go extinct, but were they overfished, over-eeled? Or or is it the environment? What's happened that they lost 90%?
It is probably a complicated soup of things, as with anything else. Some of it is going to be overfishing. We don't eat a lot of eels in Western culture, right?
Right.
They are super popular in Japanese and Chinese cuisine. And so the Japanese eels particularly have been overfished. In Europe, a lot of it is environmental. So eels have this sort of long migratory pathway, right? Where there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And one of the things that can go wrong for them is they can't get around. They have a really hard time with hydroelectric dams. In the medieval era, they could go up and over and around medieval dams because they weren't that big, weren't that complicated. But hydroelectric dams pose them a lot of problems. And you can build eel passes and fish ladders and things like that, but they're not as effective as you would like. So there have been, the massive sort of wave of dam construction in the middle part of the 20th century was really problematic for eels. So there's that. They've lost a lot of habitat. They tend to live in low-lying swampy areas, which we like to drain and build housing developments on. So a lot of it has to do with the fact that their pathways, their migratory pathways have been cut off, and their habitats have been lost. They are susceptible to pollution and climate change and other things as well. It's difficult sometimes to get a sense for what sort of is causing swings in eel populations, because they have, especially like the European ones, is like it's a 3-year migratory cycle between like when they leave the Sargasso and when they get to England, or up to 3 years. So like there's a lot that can go wrong in that period.
Mhm.
Um, so there is that. The overfishing is an issue. The eels are the most heavily smuggled animal on Earth, because they're, like I said, they're super popular in China and Japan and Asian cultures, and so it's estimated that something like a quarter to a third of the little elvers that come ashore in Europe every year, are caught and smuggled to in suitcases, basically smuggled to Asia, where they're grown in ponds and then butchered and sold around the world.
Huh.
So that's a really big issue for them too. Interpol's called it
Mhm.
Europe's ivory trade. But they're the most heavily smuggled animal on Earth, both in terms of like sheer number and in terms of value. That's like the black market for eels is like a $4 to $5 billion a year black market.
Is the reason the history of them, the biology of them, and then the criminal enterprise around them not well known because they're yucky? Is that like what the boils down to?
Yes, I think so. I think that's a big part of it, actually. Like,
because that's a crazy number, 4 to 5 billion.
Yeah.
Color me surprised. I can see why you're constantly surprised as you discover more and more about eels.
It's a really, like, they're a fascinating fish with a fascinating interplay with our history that is still going on in just different ways than it used to. But yeah, one of the problems that eels face is that they are not charismatic megafauna, right? They're not majestic like a lion or an elephant or something like that, and they're not cute like an otter, where like it's really easy to get people on board with saving those things. You're like, oh, it's so cute. Oh, that's just, it fills me with awe. Like nobody has that reaction when you show them an eel. It's really more like, ew.
Yeah.
Like they look like snakes and they move like snakes. And we have as a species, like we have a well ingrained, developed fear of snakes that is like deep within our core. We are all at some level afraid of snakes, and the movement of snakes freaks us out. And eels move like snakes. They are actively slimy in a way that snakes aren't. We think of snakes as slimy, but like eels really are slimy. And there's just super mysterious, right? So like, yeah, it is difficult to get people on board with the idea of saving eels. It's one of the things that like I said, I started doing social media posts and Twitter posts about eels just because they were funny. But my sort of the rationale that developed over a couple of years was that I realized, like, one of the things that I can do is I can make eels funny. I can make you laugh about eels and think about eels by sort of pointing out the really ridiculous ways that they are, or interesting ways that they've been a part of our past, and by making a joke about it, making a meme about it, and like making you laugh and think. And that one of the things that I can do is I can move eels in people's imagination from a fish that they almost never think about. And when they do, they are thinking about electric eels, or they're thinking about the shrieking eels in The Princess Bride, or they're thinking about how gross eels are. To thinking about like, oh, that's a fish that, like, I know a lot of really funny stories about that fish, and about like the way that they've been a part of our past. And so that's a way of sort of leveraging the work that I've done to help eels by like moving them from a species nobody cares about to a species that people think about sometimes, right? And that's really important because, like you said, they're kind of gross. They're slimy. They're weird. We don't think about them a whole lot. They're not a part of our diet. They're not a part of our culture. They're really not very visible to us. So like a lot of the work that I do goes into trying to make eels visible in positive ways.
I may have a predisposition to be interested in weird historical stuff, but I'll tell you, it works. That's exactly how the interaction happened when I brought up to Lynn and Patrick, was like, hey, we should interview this eel guy. And they're like, eels. And I was like, let me tell you all the funny things about, like, crazy stuff about eels. And I had like 5 or 6 of your, like, it was stuff from your Blue Sky feed that I was repeating.
And it worked.
So yeah, as described, it's exactly how that happened.
It's been really. I'm glad. That makes me happy.
Yeah.
It's been really affirming in that. So when I started doing work on eels, you couldn't find it like eels in English history. You couldn't find anything about it. Like if you Googled eels English history, you got like 2 things, and that was it. And at this point, you Google it, you get a lot, and it's mostly due to the work that I've done, and so that's very
Nice.
rewarding. Like, it, and a lot of it is like, oh my God, look at this really ridiculous thing about eels, but that's okay because that's like that moves people into learning, and that's progress. That's progress. So
So let's talk about eels historically. I think the most fun aspect to me was talking about the eels as currency
yeah.
and eel rent because I think about tobacco as currency and
Mhm.
bartering, but eels is one thing I have never in my life contemplated as being a form of currency.
Sure. I hadn't either. And this was, and neither had any of the people on my committee or most of the people I'd spoken to. And this was one of the things that got me, well, not in trouble. So I was going to say got me in trouble, like writing the dissertation, but it's one of the things that got me bogged down writing the dissertation was like, this was a thing that I thought would take me like 10 pages to write about. And instead
Mhm.
there's a 50-page chapter, you know? Um, so yeah, so they were used as currency or like a de facto currency in medieval England. So there's a couple of things going on here. One is that prior to the Norman invasion in 1066, there's very little actual hard currency in England. They haven't minted a whole lot of it, and the hard currency that exists doesn't actually tend to like circulate. It generally it like the only people that have it are the really rich people, and they don't buy things with it. They kind of like trade it back and forth and like give it to each other as gifts. It's a status symbol, not like an actual viable currency.
Like cryptocurrency today.
Something like that, yeah. But more stable.
Sure.
Um, yeah. So there's not a whole lot of actual currency. So like if you're going to have any kind of economy, it's going to be some sort of barter based economy, right? Like, and if you are a landlord, the point of being a landlord is to collect something from your tenants, right?
Right.
Like if you're not actually collecting rent from your tenants, like you're not doing a good job at landlording. And if they don't have money, you have to take your rent in something else. And so the medieval English landlords in the 10th century, say, they tended to take most of their rent in kind things, so in grain or eggs or honey or eels. And they took a lot of eels. Eels were the most common in-kind rent in the Doomsday Book. So more than corn, more than grain, more than anything else. So most common. Um, and I did a lot of counting of eels and eel rents as part of my dissertation. And the number that I came up with in like at the end of the 11th century, so like after Doomsday, so uh, for any of your listeners that don't know, so the Doomsday Survey, the Normans conquer England, and then after like 20 years, they decide they need to know like what they've actually got a hold of, and so they send out people all over the country, or not all over the country, but to a lot of parts of the country to sort of make a collection of all of the different charters and all of the different like hold to get a sense of like what are the holdings, what are the responsibilities, what's owed, what have we actually conquered here. And that's the Doomsday Book. It's a fantastic, though very incomplete, sort of snapshot of what's going on in England in 1086. So if you add up all the eel rents from Doomsday and the ones that I knew about from before that are not in Doomsday but are still extant, you get about 540,000 eels that were being paid every year in England in rent, or at least were due every year in England in rent, which is quite a lot. And that number stays pretty consistent for the next couple hundred years. Most in-kind rents start to disappear in the next 100 years. So, like in the 12th century, so in the 1100s, as the Normans print's the wrong word, as they mint a lot of money, you start getting a lot more currency in the market, and a lot of the in-kind rents for grain or eggs or whatever disappear as landlords want their their rent paid in money. And some of the eel rents get transitioned to money, but the majority of them stay as eel rents. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of the major landlords collecting eel rents were monasteries, um, and they used their eel rents were mostly due right before Lent, so they um, you know, Lent's a time where you're not supposed to eat meat, but you can't eat fish. Eels are a fish, and even better than like a regular fish, these are a fish that are believed to be asexual, so like completely not
Just alien.
not carnal at all. Like you're
Yeah.
not like the thing about eating, you're not supposed to eat meat, right? Because, and Thomas Aquinas talks about this, you're not supposed to eat meat because it makes you think about sex. Because it comes from an animal that has sex, and you can watch it having sex, and man, that's hot. But fish, you don't see fish having sex, and eels, so that's good. So fish are like good. Like you eat fish because it doesn't make you think about sex. And Lent's a time where you're supposed to be focusing on holy things, not earthly things. So sex is out. Yeah. But eels are asexual. Like they not only do we not see them having sex, like they don't have sex.
No one told that to the Japanese.
Well, no, and it's a funny thing that so this is sort of the theological understanding of eels. This idea that like they don't have sex, and so like eating eels doesn't make you think about sex at all. It's great, it's fantastic. It's a very chaste food, and it's this belief like coincides with a separate track about eels, which is like, hey, those things look like penises, and so like eels are fantastic phallic metaphors in English writing for like throughout this period. So like it's a very two-track thing. Like you've got your theology, which is like, this is great, not thinking about sex at all. You've got your people like Shakespeare who are like, yeah, he's got some eels in his pants. It's a really fascinating cultural divergence there. But yeah. So but the monastic landlords collect most of their eel rents right before Lent, and then they eat them throughout Lent, and then they collect them in they're dried. So the eels, they're migratory. They migrate downstream in the fall. I said the little babies get to shore in the spring. So the upstream migration is in the spring. The downstream migration, where they're heading back out to sea, is in the fall. And those are the eels that are caught, the silver eels, because those are the ones that are fattest and sort of the biggest. And so they are caught between like late August and early November. It's sort of when most of the migration happens. So they're caught then, and then they are salted and smoked in a process that takes several months. And then they're paid, usually the eel rents were due, like I said, right before Lent. So that changes depending on the year, but sometime in the spring.
That makes a lot more sense than what I was picturing with people like, for lack of a better word, peasants delivering very wet baskets to people.
Or like a big tank. I know, I was thinking that too, like a big goldfish bag.
Yeah. That's what I was picturing in my head, which in retrospect makes no sense.
Yeah, no, right, because like some of these are really big rents. Like the biggest one is the village of Harmston owes the Earl of Chester, and this is in the Doomsday Book, 75,000 eels a year.
75,000.
Yeah. No, what the hell that guy's doing with 75,000 eels? I have no idea. But like that's what it was. And some of the rents are a lot smaller. Like some of them are, like you owe me 25 eels a year to fish this spot. But some of them are really big. There are a handful of rents I could point to that are specifically asking for live eels, or ones that have been very recently killed, but they're probably live, because eels go bad super fast, like in a couple hours. So if you're not going to like salt and smoke them, you probably better deliver them live. And you can do that. You can put them in a barrel. The best way to do it is not to put them in a barrel of water, like in your fish bag, but because if they're in there for too long, they'll use up all the oxygen. It's in there for a couple of days, but rather to put them, because they can live out of water as long as they've got something that helps them like breathe, so it helps the air transpire through them. So if you put them in a barrel and pack them between like layers of wet hay or moss, they can live in the barrel for a week or so. So there are a
Oh,
handful of
and
rents
these
that are
these are the
asking.
ones that are not eating anymore, right? Because they're headed out, right? So that
Yeah.
they don't,
Yep.
right? So they're not
Right.
going
Yeah.
to
So
starve.
they're not
Huh?
like, I'm so hungry in here, man.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so
They're just eating
yeah,
themselves.
yeah. So there are a handful of rents that are asking for live eels, but those are asking for like 10 eels,
Right.
25, 50 eels.
Sure.
Like those are like, we're going to have a feast
Premium. Yeah.
tonight or like on Tuesday, and we would like some live eels, please. The trade in eels to London, those eel ships, those are big floating aquariums. Those are live eels. So like basically what those ships are is like they're a well ship. Like if you've ever watched like Deadliest Catch,
Hmm.
where
Yeah.
they pile all the crabs into the hold of the ship that's full of water. That's essentially what these ships are in the Thames. These eel ships. They're these well ships. So the hold is full of water and full of eels, and they have to help with circulation. They have holes in the side of the ships, either really small holes, like a bunch of really small holes, or some big ones that they have grates over. And then they park them out in not right by the shore, but like out in the middle of the current, so they get circulation through them. And then you take a smaller ship out to the Dutch eel ships. You get on board, and you're like, I need 6 pounds of eels, and they pull them out and weigh them and give them to you, and off you go.
Huh.
Um, and
That is wild.
and the ships that I was looking at on those maps are from the 17th century, and they start trading live eels. The Dutch start trading live eels like this in probably about 1450 to 1470, something like that. Before that, they're doing a pretty brisk trade in salted and smoked eels, but they start doing this live trade in these ships in the mid 15th century. And other than like a 15-year period in the middle of the Anglo-Dutch Wars in the 17th century, they stay on the Thames selling eels out of these ships until 1938. Which is one of my favorite things about this. Like they're still
What?
there, and it's basically the same ships. They've added a motor to them, like an engine, but that's it. Otherwise, they're the same ships, and they just park these spaces on the Thames, and they stay there and sell eels. And through the May, and I think it's Mayhew talks about it in the 19th century. They're they have like essentially a de facto monopoly on eel sales in London. They've about 90% of the eels that are sold in London are sold through these ships.
And
Pretty
that's
sure
a
that's the year
lot of
my
eels.
grandfather was born.
And
Like that's
it's
absurd.
it's a lot of eels. Mayhew talks about in his study of the London poor, talks about how eels are the second most purchased street food in London, after dog meat, which is not like meat that you eat that's from dog, but rather like basically dog food. So like
Sure,
Okay.
like scrap.
right, scraps that
from
you
the-
buy
Yeah.
to feed your dog.
Okay.
Right. So like so
Whoa.
this is dog friendly, not not the other way around. Which I didn't know at first because I'm a medievalist, and so like the first time I saw them, like, oh my god, that's terrible. But it turns out that no, like yeah. So the most common thing people were buying from street vendors, food was food for the dogs, and then eels, and then like coffee and tea.
Wow.
That kind of makes a lot of sense. The way they described it in some of the videos I saw of jellied eels serving in
Mhm.
London is that it's
Yep.
like a fast food. It happens. You walk
Yeah.
up, you pay, and a plate comes out to you really quick.
Yeah,
You're able to-
there's
it's
a
hearty
there's
and
a
you can eat.
fun video of I think Audrey Hepburn getting like a bowl of eels that way. Yeah, and yeah, they're basically street vendors. Yes, it's fast food. Like you get your little bowl of eels in either jelly eels, or like before they did jelly, they cook them in butter, right? And then
Yeah.
off you go. And it makes sense that uh, they're a super common poor person's food, and it's what they become. Like they're super common, like they're all over the place. They're really high in fat and protein, and so like man, you stop on your way home from your job as a longshoreman, you get a bowl of hot, fat, salty meat. You eat
Yeah.
it, you're good to go, right? That it does become a poor person's food sort of from sort of 17th century onward, up through the point when I saw the ships, right? Like on those maps, up through the mid 17th century, it's still a food that pretty much everybody eats. So like the king down to peasants. After, I think there's a period of like 15 years in the latter part of that century where the Dutch ships get kicked off the Thames. It's part of the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The English are trying to like reinvigorate their own eel fishing economy, and like we can do this, we can make our own eels, and they can't, so they wind up having to invite the Dutch back. But that seems to be a bit of a transition point, after which they really pick up a much more sort of a lower class vibe. So
So moving from eels as food and currency. There are also aspects of identity. They're on family crests.
Hmm.
So what are they trying to say when you have an eel on a family crest? Is it you have a lot of money? Is that you're chaste? Is it that the opposite? Like what is the
We were landlords. We have a lot of land holdings.
we
Yeah,
have we
yeah.
have a lot of eels. No, that's a fun question. So they do show up as they form a really interesting part of English identity in a way that they don't anywhere else on the continent, as far as I can tell.
Hmm.
Like I said, there are people eat eels in France and Italy and Spain and the Netherlands. The Netherlands is the only other country that has anything close to like sort of an eel culture in the way that England does. But England is fairly unique in this. And one, so they think of themselves as an eel eating people, and it shows up in a bunch of ways. And one of the ways it shows up is that there are eels and eel traps and herons eating eels on a number of English family crests, as you said. And
Mhm.
this is pretty unique to England. They are there. This doesn't happen in France. This doesn't happen almost never in Spain or in Germany. There are a couple of eels show up on some civic crests, like city crests, basically
Mhm.
in France and in Germany on the Seine and on the Rhine, places that do a ton of like eel catching and eel selling. So like they're sort of a part of the civic economy, but they don't show up like as a personal badge. Um, so very often it's a joke. And I can't. So there's a word for it, and I can never remember what it is. But like, where it's a pun. So like, if your family's name is Ellis, which doesn't actually have anything to do
Eelis.
with eels, you might put
Right.
eels on your family crest. Um, uh, so that sort of thing happens a lot. Um, but also there are some that are just like, I own a land that has a lot of eels on it, and I'm going to have eels on my crest, or an
Sure.
eel, or an eel spear, or here's a heron with an eel on it. So they do show up. They show up a lot in on family crests that way, and they show up in a lot of other ways of sort of that let you know that this is a part of people's identity.
Mhm.
It's a really fun aspect. It's one of the I wrote an entire chapter of the dissertation was about sort of eels and questions of identity. Um, so they
So when is
yeah.
this going to be a book? When is this dissertation
Yeah.
coming out as a
I've
book?
no, I that's a when I get off my butt and do it is the answer to that, I'm afraid. Yeah, no, I really need to and want to. It's sort of hard to it's hard to find the time to do it. It's also
Fair.
frankly hard to find there's a bit of motivation to it too, because like I know that I have to rewrite the thing to make it into a book, and I
Mhm.
have to
Yeah.
like I have it is currently in its dissertation structure, which
Right.
doesn't work for like I think a trade press works best, but even for an academic press, it needs to be rewritten and restructured. And like, man, it's hard to do. It is hard to take a project that you've spent 6 years on, um, and then sort of pull it back apart again and
Put
like
it back together.
reassemble it, sort of
Yeah.
relego it together. Especially since like I don't have a job in academia. This is not like a
Mhm.
requirement for me to keep my job. This would be like an extra thing that I'm doing on the side. So it's hard to find the motivation for that, but it's
Sure.
also a thing that I really want to do.
Perhaps an alternative, you're a cartographer, so I imagine you're very talented at drawing. I could definitely see a Finding Dory type movie where you follow the eel's life cycle.
I have no issue feeding my 2-year-old son a children's book full of eel propaganda if you're
Nice.
down to write it.
I would read it.
So, I will tell you that talking about women and eels. So Rachel Carson wrote just such a book, actually,
Oh yeah.
um, called Under the Trade Winds. I can't remember the name of the book off the top of my head, but it was one of the first things that she wrote. Actually, was a book about eels and their migratory pathways. And she wrote it as a pamphlet for the it's Fish and Wildlife or whatever division she was working for,
Uh-huh.
and her boss was like, "No, we can't do this. This is too good." Like and too long and too like this is not appropriate for a government pamphlet, but let's find you a publisher for it.
It's
Well,
called
we'll put a
Under the
link to that.
Under the Sea Wind, a
Under the
naturalist
sea winds,
pictures
that's
of
right. Yeah.
ocean life. Yeah,
hmm
yeah.
Yeah, and
Fantastic.
it sort of it personifies. There's a couple different animals that she follows, but she like basically personifies a couple of different animals, gives them names and personalities, and sort of follows them on their life
Aw.
cycle. It's really good.
Oh, very cool.
We'll put a
Well,
link to that in our show notes. Absolutely.
Good.
That sounds great.
yeah.
So I'm
Before,
happy to
so
write a book, but
yeah.
there is the book that you're asking for already exists, and it's written
All
by
right.
somebody who's really good at writing.
But so we're getting close to our full hour here. But before we hop off, I wanted to know if there were any other tidbits, or like even like how eels show up. Any favorite stories, how they show up in like mythology, or any real history, or anything that you were like, oh, this is one of the funniest instances of eel uh, buffoonery or
Yeah. Okay.
silliness.
So I've got a good one for you. So so I said there's no eels on the west coast of the U.S., right? Because
Mhm.
because the baby eels they follow the currents and they don't like cold water particularly, and the the Pacific currents just that take the Japanese eels to Japan it takes too long basically to get to the west coast of the U.S., and so the eels just don't make it. There's lots of lampreys, but those are different things. But in the sort of mid to late 19th century, um, there was a guy at Fish and Wildlife, his name I don't remember, who decided that we ought to have eels on the west coast, and so what we're going to do is we are going to transport them by train from the east coast to the west coast. We're going to put them in the rivers, and we're going to build an eel population that way. And
Okay.
yeah, and so there was like this 15-year history of period in which they tried to do this several times. There's a train crash in Nebraska at one point that spills eels and other fish sort of all over the place. And so like there's a weird little part of Nebraska that has like a wildly unusual fishing like fish population still. Um,
Oh my
um,
god.
but yeah, so they do wind up eventually. There's a bunch of like start and stop issues. They do eventually wind up getting a couple of thousand eels into the Sacramento River,
Mhm.
where they hang out and live like you would expect. Um, but because they didn't understand what the eel's life cycle was, right? They're like,
Right.
this should be fine. And of course, eventually, what happens is the eels, their biological clock kicks over, and they're like, okay, it's time to go, and they swim out to sea, and they're like probably confused as hell because
Right.
they navigate, as far as we can tell, they navigate by sort of magnetism, to magnetic fields. And so like they're just going to basically, they almost certainly all swam and swam and swam until they died.
Sure.
But like they're not getting back to the Sargasso. There's no way they could have.
Right.
And even if they had, they're certainly not coming back to California. So um, so it's one of those. It's a tragic story in some ways. It's a funny story in some ways, and it's a really telling story about what happens when we try to mess around with the balance of nature and with the way things work without actually understanding it. Right. So like,
Right.
there's this guy who's like, it's easy. We'll take eels from the Hudson and we'll put them in the Sacramento, and it'll work out great. And
I
it
put
doesn't
fish in my
because
pond in my backyard, right? Like it should be
exactly,
easy.
right? What's the difference? What's the
What's the
difference?
Yeah.
difference? Yeah.
Yeah. And so so there's like 10 years where there's eels in the Sacramento River. Um, uh,
Huh.
but then that's about it.
That is
So what
bizarre.
sort of it goes with our usual final questions. We talk about historic sites and going to
Mhm.
visit historic sites, support them. Where can I go? I'm on the East Coast. Where can I go if I want to see live eels or I want to take people and say, let's look at these animals and see we need to
Take in some
save
eel
them.
history or like
Yeah, take in some
Sure.
history, maybe meet one or
Yeah.
two eels, see what it's about.
Okay. So there are still eels on the east coast of the U.S.
Okay.
It's still a pretty vibrant part of the economy in Maine, where they are the second
Hmm.
biggest cash crop after lobsters, basically.
oh,
Um,
Wow.
so you can go to Maine to see eel fishing,
Mm-hmm.
and probably eels. There are eels sort of up and down the East Coast. Um, if you live near New York, I know that the New York Fish and Wildlife does a citizen science project every spring on the Hudson, where they have people go out and sort of trap and count the elvers coming upstream, and then
Oh.
let them go again, right? So you get a sense. They're trying to
Hmm.
get a sense for how many, like what the eel population is going up the Hudson and where it's going. And so that may be your best bet for like going to handle an eel, like to actually touch an eel.
Hmm.
Is a little elver. Um, the guy who runs that is a guy named Chris Bowser, who's really does a fantastic job. One of the you talked about the earlier Isaac, the issue with like eels being gross and slimy and weird, right?
Yeah.
And Chris got a great line about that. He said the thing is like, I get people interested in eels by talking about their history. He gets them interested in eels by like getting them out in the water when like get an eel in their hand. He's like, and the thing is to get people to go from ew to like, oh, right, like
Sure.
transition of like this is gross to like, oh no,
Yeah.
this is amazing. Look at this little thing. So
Yeah.
so there are a couple places like that. I mean, there are eels up and down the east coast of the U.S. In wild spaces, but they
Hmm.
don't like to be seen, and they're hard to see if you don't know what you're looking for. So,
Right.
um, colonial America has some history with eels,
Hmm.
but it's just like you're talking about, like going to places, historical places where eels matter. I would say go to England, go to Ely, go to the cathedral. They have an eel day every spring, where they have a big
What?
Oh, there you
yeah,
go.
yeah.
Yeah.
Where they have like there's a parade where the school children have like an eel float. It's a whole thing. So I would go to the Eel Day Festival in Ely in
Yeah.
England. Yeah.
That's easy to remember. Eel Day Festival, Ely, England.
Yep. All the E's. Yeah.
That's
Well,
fantastic.
John, this was, I mean, a really, really fascinating discussion. Obviously, there's more to talk about, because you said, like there's, there's more and
I could
more and
keep
more
going
and
for a
more.
really long time.
Yeah. So we'll have to have you back to even just talk about the map side of things and
Yeah.
Yeah.
the cartographic side of stuff at some point in the future. But thank you so much for sharing some eel knowledge. And everyone, go follow. What is your Blue Sky handle? Because I don't have it on here.
Greenlee JW.
Yeah, go follow Greenlee JW over on Blue Sky for
Mhm.
eel memes once a day.
Yeah.
And is there any
Or
other
you can
place
just
you
look
want
for
to?
the Surprised Eel Historian.
Yes.
Will find me as well. Yep.
Perfect. Yeah. And we'll obviously put links to all of that stuff in our show notes, so you can check that out. And as
Absolutely.
always, this conversation was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon, where you can get early access to the video version of our episodes as well as exclusive content. So if you like the show and like to support us, please go check it out. It is not expensive. And even if you just sign up for free, you can get access to our Discord, where Lynn and I have some fun discussions with some of the historians that we've interviewed, and to chat about history stuff in general. But thanks so much again, John, for being here.
Oh, thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
having me. I really enjoyed it.